A black woman is told to give up her VIP seat for a white passenger. What happens next shocks everyone on board and sets off a chain reaction that no one saw coming. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment down below where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Sierra Williams stepped onto the plane with a sense of quiet triumph, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor of the jetway. The hum of anticipation from the other passengers felt distant, almost muffled, as if the world outside had been left behind when she crossed the threshold into the first-class cabin. She could already feel the plushness of the seats, the soft glow of the lighting, and the faint scent of leather and rich wood. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, as if the entire cabin was made just for her, a space where she had earned the right to exist. At 32, Sierra had worked for everything she had, clawing her way up from a childhood in a rough neighborhood where the odds were stacked against her. Now, seated in this sleek, luxurious first-class cabin aboard an international flight from New York to London, she could finally appreciate the fruits of her labor. It wasn't just about the privilege of sitting in a spacious, reclining seat with gourmet meals at her fingertips. It was the sense of justice she felt, the knowledge that she had triumphed in a world that rarely made room for people like her. She took her seat by the window, adjusting her seatbelt and sinking into the comfort of the leather, a moment of stillness washing over her as the plane began to taxi down the runway. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a wave of satisfaction enveloping her. She had made it. No one could take this from her, not now, not anymore. The flight attendants, professional and efficient, moved through the cabin with an almost practiced calm. One of them, a woman with a high bun and sharp eyes, greeted Sierra with a soft, polite smile. "Good evening, ma'am. May I offer you a drink? We have champagne, wine, or a selection of cocktails available." Sierra smiled back, her lips curving into a polite but reserved expression. "Champagne, please," she said, her voice steady. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the gesture. It was just that she had grown accustomed to the distance people often placed between themselves and those they deemed less deserving. She had learned to accept these small, impersonal exchanges as part of the game. She wasn't just a customer here. She was an anomaly. She settled back in her seat, waiting for the drink to arrive, allowing herself a brief moment of reflection. As a senior marketing executive at one of the top firms in her industry, Sierra had worked tirelessly for years, often putting in long nights and battling prejudice, whether overt or subtle, from colleagues and clients alike. Yet every win, every small advancement, had built the foundation that led her here. There was pride in this space, a space that few people who looked like her ever got to occupy. But that pride was tempered by the knowledge that her success was rare. The reality of being a black woman in a predominantly white, elite corporate world was never far from her mind. She had to fight twice as hard to get half as far, and there was always the constant pressure to prove herself, to fight back against the unspoken biases that shaped every room she entered. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she was a woman of power and dignity, a woman who had earned every moment of this flight. As the cabin doors closed and the plane began its ascent, the rhythmic roar of the engines filled the space around her. Sierra closed her eyes briefly, letting the sounds of the aircraft wash over her like a lullaby. The hum of the plane, the subtle vibrations beneath her feet, was somehow comforting, almost like an old friend. In this moment, she was untouchable. She was still lost in the quiet serenity of her thoughts when the soft chime of the flight attendant's voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice said, followed by the sound of high heels clicking toward her. Sierra opened her eyes and saw a flight attendant mid-40s, with sharp features and an air of authority walking toward her. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I need to ask you to move." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Sierra's mind didn't register them. She blinked and looked up at the woman, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I beg your pardon?" Sierra's voice was calm but firm, a well-practiced tone of authority that she had learned to adopt in moments like this. She was no stranger to being asked to move or step aside, but the words still stung. After all, she was in one of the best seats on the plane, the seat she had paid for. the seat she had earned. The gentleman in the seat across the aisle, the flight attendant explained, glancing over her shoulder toward the front of the cabin. He has a priority booking and needs this seat. I'm sorry, but you'll have to move. Sierra's heart skipped a beat. Something about the tone of the flight attendant's voice, the almost apologetic yet assertive way she spoke, set her on edge. She could see the shift in the woman's demeanor, an uncomfortable politeness that felt like a dismissal. Sierra inhaled slowly, processing the situation. I'm sorry, but this is my seat, she replied, her voice calm but insistent. She motioned to the seat assignment slip attached to her ticket, her finger tracing the printed letters of her name. The flight attendant, not backing down, glanced again at the seat reservation chart in her hand. I understand, ma'am, she said, her voice growing more insistent. But this passenger is a priority. He's a high-profile client, and we need to accommodate him. Sierra's chest tightened, the familiar rush of frustration creeping up her spine. It was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't naive. She knew what was happening. She had been down this road before.
No, she thought.
Not this time.
Not now.
She looked the flight attendant in the eye, steadying her breath. I'm sorry, but I'm not moving, Sierra said. I paid for this seat. I'm staying. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the front of the cabin, as if waiting for permission from someone higher up. Then, with a tight smile, she nodded and said, Very well. I'll let you know if there are any further issues. Sierra leaned back in her seat, her gaze never leaving the flight attendant as she walked away. Her fingers curled into fists on her lap. She had expected this. There was always someone, somewhere, ready to remind her of her place. But she wasn't going to let it happen this time. As the plane climbed higher, the city below shrinking into nothingness, Sierra stared out the window, her reflection mingling with the clouds outside. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Not when she had fought so hard to get here. She had earned this seat, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The flight continued, the tension in the air slowly building. What started as a quiet moment of achievement was about to turn into something far bigger, something that would challenge not only Sierra's sense of justice, but the very foundations of the world she had worked so hard to conquer. The cabin hummed with the soft, rhythmic sound of the airplane as it ascended into the sky, leaving the bustle of New York behind. The soft click of seatbelts being fastened, the hushed whispers of passengers settling in. The first-class section, as always, felt like a world of its own. Sierra Williams settled deeper into her plush seat, the warm leather cradling her body as the stewardess passed by, offering champagne. It was one of those rare moments when she allowed herself to fully indulge, to forget the endless meetings and the late nights spent drafting proposals. The glass of champagne shimmered under the overhead lights, and Sierra took a sip, feeling the crisp bubbles rise to her chest, soothing her after a long week. She thought back to the triumphs of the past few years, how she had worked tirelessly, broken barriers in an industry not built for women of color, and how, in this moment, she had earned her place. The VIP seat, nestled in the front of the first-class cabin, was hers by right, a testament to her accomplishments. But as she looked around at the other passengers, their faces, familiar with privilege, seemed to gaze upon her without the same warmth she extended to them. She brushed the thought aside. She wasn't here to ruminate on what she couldn't change. She was here to relax, to enjoy the moment. But then, as if summoned by a deep-seated unease she could not explain, a shadow crossed over her. Sierra didn't notice the tall, well-dressed man until he was almost upon her, too late to avert her gaze, too late to ignore the subtle aura of entitlement he radiated. Thomas Harrington, his suit pristine and sharp, moved down the aisle with a self-assurance that seemed to carve through the air around him. His demeanor was calm, almost practiced, as though he had walked through this exact moment 100 times before. Sierra felt a stir of unease as his eyes briefly met hers. Cool, disinterested. Then, with a curt nod, he turned to the flight attendant, a younger woman named Alice, who was carrying a tray of drinks toward the front of the cabin. He spoke in a voice laced with practiced authority, low but clear enough for those in the immediate vicinity to hear. "Excuse me, this is my seat," he said, pointing to Sierra's seat with a finger that hovered over her shoulder, as though it were a formality. Sierra blinked. There was no way she misheard. This was her seat. She paid for it. She had verified the reservation when she boarded. She looked around, half expecting the flight attendants to step in, to do their job, to manage the situation. But Alice, unsure of how to handle the sudden shift in power, hesitated. Sierra could feel the weight of his presence now, hovering over her like a storm cloud, suffocating the air around her. "Excuse me?" Sierra said, her voice measured, yet laced with confusion. "What did you say?" The man turned, his face a mask of politeness, though there was something unnervingly cold about it. "I believe this is my seat," he repeated, with an emphasis that suggested he wasn't quite used to being questioned. "It was confirmed for me by your staff. I'm afraid you'll have to vacate it." Sierra's heart stuttered for a moment. Her stomach churned, but she held her composure. She had encountered this kind of subtle dismissal before, too many times to count. She had climbed the ranks of her career, fought for every inch, and yet, in the presence of this stranger, there was an overwhelming sense of displacement. But she was not about to back down. Not today. Not after everything she had sacrificed. She stood up slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake," she said, her voice firm, though the heat rising in her chest threatened to betray her calm facade. "I have this seat reserved. It's mine." Thomas's eyes flicked to the flight attendant, who had been standing there awkwardly. "Can you handle this?" he asked her, his voice carrying a thin edge of impatience. Alice nodded, trying her best to maintain professionalism. "Of course, sir. I'll get this sorted out right away." But it was Rebecca, the flight attendant supervisor, who appeared, gliding toward them with practiced grace, her uniform pristine, her posture immaculate. Rebecca had been on duty for over 12 hours, but there was no sign of fatigue. She had dealt with difficult customers before, especially those with inflated senses of importance, but something about the way Thomas carried himself felt different. She had been a flight attendant for decades. She could recognize the markers of wealth, power, and privilege the moment they walked into the cabin. "Is there a problem here?" Rebecca asked, her voice cool, but with a hint of underlying tension, as though she sensed the strain in the air. Thomas's smile widened, but it was a cold smile, practiced to a perfection that spoke of entitlement. "Yes, this woman," he said, pointing again at Sierra, "is occupying my seat. I'm afraid it was reserved for me." Rebecca glanced down at her manifest. "I see," she said, her eyes flicking briefly from Thomas to Sierra. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This seat was specifically requested for this gentleman." Sierra's eyes narrowed. She had heard these words before. She had fought them in boardrooms, in meetings, in conversations where the special requests were often only ever made for people who looked like Thomas. "I don't think there's a misunderstanding," Sierra said quietly, but with an unmistakable firmness. "I paid for the seat. I'm not going anywhere." Rebecca looked between the two of them, trying to measure the situation, the power dynamics shifting with every passing second. Sierra, standing tall, was clearly not going to yield, but Thomas was used to getting what he wanted. And in his mind, this was a minor inconvenience. His gaze flicked from Rebecca to Sierra, and then he exhaled slowly, as though this were something he had expected to happen. He was the one who belonged here. She did not. The subtle undertones of his confidence unsettled Sierra more than the directness of his words. "Ma'am," Rebecca continued, her voice lowering just slightly, as if she were explaining a difficult concept to a child, "I'm going to have to ask you to vacate the seat. There are, unfortunately, certain priorities when it comes to seating arrangements." Sierra's breath caught. The word priority sliced through her like a blade. She had heard it 1,000 times in different forms. It always meant the same thing. Someone else, someone more deserving of privilege, someone who wasn't her, would always be granted the space she had earned. "Priorities?" Sierra repeated, her voice calm, but the words burned. And who decides who gets priority? Rebecca faltered for a moment, a crack in her composure appearing. It's company policy. This passenger's reservation was confirmed with special accommodations. Sierra's gaze hardened. She had worked for everything she had in this life. Every single seat she had occupied, every inch she had claimed, was earned. I'm sure his priority is just as important as mine, she said, with a bite in her words that made Rebecca take a small step back, but I'm not giving up my seat for anyone. The moment Rebecca Mallory approached Sierra, the weight of the encounter seemed to press down on the entire cabin. A sudden chill filled the air, despite the warmth of the airplane's climate control. The hum of the engines was the only sound that seemed to remain steady, the tension hanging in every corner of the first-class cabin like an invisible storm cloud. Sierra could feel the shift in energy as Rebecca stood in front of her seat, clipboard in hand, her gaze fixed firmly on the document. The polite smile Rebecca wore didn't quite reach her eyes, and there was an uncomfortable stiffness to her posture, as if her uniform somehow made her feel more distant from the situation unfolding. "Excuse me, ma'am," Rebecca said, her voice polite but carrying a forced edge of authority. "I'm afraid I'll need you to vacate your seat. This passenger," she gestured toward Thomas Harrington, the well-dressed businessman who had just stepped into the aisle, clearly accustomed to receiving instant deference. His eyes were already fixed on Sierra's seat, a look of barely concealed entitlement etched across his face. Sierra's brow furrowed. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, sitting up straighter in her chair. She could feel the surprise rising in her chest, an uncomfortable mix of disbelief and unease. Was this really happening? "This seat," Rebecca continued, as if the words would make more sense if she repeated them, "is reserved for him. It was specifically requested for this passenger." Sierra's pulse quickened. She glanced at Thomas, who met her gaze for a brief moment before glancing away with an air of impatience, his hand adjusting his cufflinks. It wasn't the look of a man who was uncomfortable, nor of one who cared to reason or explain. It was the look of someone who expected things to unfold his way.
His way.
Sierra's mind raced. Was this really happening? She couldn't recall ever hearing of a case where a passenger, especially one who had paid for a first-class seat, was asked to give up their seat for someone else. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something more insidious, something she had encountered countless times before in a world that still saw her as other. "No," she said, her voice firm and unyielding. "I'm not moving." Rebecca blinked, caught off guard by the blunt refusal. She cleared her throat and glanced at Thomas, then back to Sierra, trying once more, though her words were noticeably softer this time. "I understand that this might be difficult, but it's the airline's policy. The seat has been assigned to him." Sierra's hand gripped the armrest. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, the familiar sting of being perceived as someone who didn't belong, despite her place here. She could hear the murmurs of passengers around her, their eyes flickering from one to the other, sensing the shift in the air. The moment had become charged, pregnant with unspoken judgments, assumptions, and the power dynamics that played out in micro-moments like these. "I've paid for this seat, and I'm entitled to it," Sierra said, her voice rising with a calm but steely edge. "Just like anyone else on this flight." She met Rebecca's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "If there's a problem, it's with your policy, not with me." Rebecca's lips pressed together in a thin line. "I'm just following the procedure, ma'am," she said, her voice now tinged with a nervousness she couldn't hide. She glanced toward Thomas, who was growing increasingly impatient, his eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a firm line. He took a small step forward, the subtle movement enough to communicate his growing frustration. Sierra's throat tightened, but she refused to back down. She had spent years fighting battles that others couldn't or wouldn't see. She had earned her place in the world, this world, by pushing through the barriers, by working harder, by proving over and over that she deserved everything she had. And yet, here she was, being asked to leave her seat in favor of a man who likely hadn't fought a single battle in his life. "I don't care about your procedures," Sierra said, her voice steady now. "If he's so important, Then let him find another seat. I paid for mine, and I'm staying. The words hung in the air, thick and uncompromising. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The other passengers began to shift in their seats, sensing the brewing storm. Some exchanged glances. Others pretended to be absorbed in their drinks or reading material, but there was no hiding the tension. Rebecca's eyes darted from Sierra to the increasingly irritated Thomas, then back to Sierra again, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this kind of resistance. A small flicker of something, perhaps recognition, perhaps discomfort, flashed across her face. She had always prided herself on keeping things orderly, maintaining the status quo.
It was easier that way.
But now, faced with a woman who refused to conform to the unwritten rules of deference and subordination, the ground beneath Rebecca seemed to shift. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, a voice from the other side of the cabin cut through the tension. "This is ridiculous," came the voice of John Miller, a businessman seated a few rows behind Thomas. His face, stern with disapproval, had become flushed with indignation. "She's entitled to that seat, just like anyone else. Why are we even having this conversation?" More voices joined in, low at first but growing louder. "Exactly. Why are we all pretending this is acceptable?" a woman near the front added, her tone a mixture of disbelief and outrage. The ripple effect of support for Sierra was immediate. The murmurs spread like wildfire, sparking more passengers to speak up. Some passengers, too afraid to openly challenge the situation, began to quietly nod, their eyes meeting Sierra's with understanding. The old power dynamics of the airplane cabin, once unquestioned and deeply entrenched, were suddenly in flux. Rebecca's face flushed, but she held her ground. She wasn't sure whether to argue further or to retreat. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her. The passengers' eyes, now turned not just to Sierra but to her as well. She had miscalculated. She had underestimated this woman, this challenge to the system. Her authority was no longer absolute. Sierra, on the other hand, could feel a surge of energy from the passengers who were voicing their support. She wasn't alone anymore. The voices of dissent, once muffled by the rules of the airline and the expectations of social decorum, had broken through the surface, and they were all converging on one undeniable truth. Sierra had every right to sit where she was. Rebecca, still attempting to cling to her misplaced sense of control, leaned in slightly. "Ma'am, please," she said in a softer tone. "We can resolve this. Let's not make this more complicated than it has to be." But Sierra didn't waver. "There is nothing complicated about this," she said, her voice steady, her resolve unshakable. "I'm not moving." As the standoff continued, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Rebecca's attempt to control the situation had backfired. The eyes of the passengers were now on her, silently judging her, their unspoken expectations weighing heavy on her shoulders. It was no longer just about the seat, it was about power. It was about the invisible lines of privilege that had dictated who got to sit where and who was left standing. And Sierra? She was done being invisible. The plane hummed steadily through the sky, the soft vibrations of the engines a constant undercurrent to the increasingly tense atmosphere in first class. Sierra could feel the weight of the silence settling around her, heavy and suffocating. Her breath was shallow, her mind racing as she sat in the plush seat that had now become a battleground. Her hands, clenched in her lap, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a deep, gnawing frustration that seemed to build with every passing second. Rebecca Mallory stood there, her posture rigid and her gaze faltering, unsure of how to handle the situation that had spiraled out of her control. There was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that this was no ordinary priority seating issue. But she quickly masked it, her instincts to preserve order and maintain the flight's smooth operation pushing her forward. Her voice, once firm, now quivered slightly as she spoke again. "Ma'am," Rebecca began, her words slow and calculated, "I understand you're upset, but this is company policy. Mr. Harrington has special accommodations, and I don't care about his special accommodations, Sierra interjected, her voice sharp, cutting through Rebecca's scripted explanation like a knife. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with unyielding resolve. I care about the fact that you're telling me to give up my seat because of the color of my skin. That's what this is about, isn't it? Rebecca's mouth opened as though to respond, but no words came out. For a brief moment, the flight attendant supervisor simply stared, her face flushing a shade of red as she struggled for a reason to justify her actions. Her gaze flicked toward Thomas Harrington, who stood behind her with a look of impatience barely hidden beneath his veneer of politeness. He had been quiet so far, but it was clear he was growing increasingly irritated by the delay. His eyes darted between Sierra and Rebecca, waiting for the problem to be solved. I don't want to cause trouble, Sierra continued, her voice now steady, almost too calm. But I'm not moving. Not for him. Not for anyone. Not unless I'm given a reason that's actually valid. Thomas harumphed behind Rebecca. This is ridiculous, he muttered, his tone dripping with entitlement. I have business to attend to. Just let me sit where I was supposed to sit. It's not that hard. Sierra's eyes flicked to him, then back to Rebecca. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral, composed. She had been here before. This was nothing new. It wasn't the first time her worth had been questioned simply because of the skin she was born into. I don't care what you were supposed to do, Mr. Harrington, Sierra said, her tone biting now, each word deliberate. You've had your turn. You've had your seat. I'm not here to accommodate you, and I won't be pushed aside for you or anyone else. Rebecca's hand was trembling as she gripped the edge of the armrest beside her. Her eyes flicked nervously from Sierra to the other passengers, who were beginning to pay more attention to the confrontation. She had been in these situations before, passenger disagreements, minor irritations, but this was different. This wasn't about a small miscommunication or an easily solved issue. This was something deeper. She could feel it. The room seemed to close in on her, and for the first time in a long while, she was unsure of how to navigate the waters. She opened her mouth again, but Sierra didn't wait for her to speak. I don't want special treatment, Sierra continued, her voice low and unwavering. But I will not be treated like I don't belong. Not by you. Not by him. Not by anyone. The silence that followed hung thick and heavy. Other passengers in the cabin began to look over, some with confused expressions, others with a quiet sense of solidarity, murmuring to each other. An older man seated nearby leaned forward, catching Sierra's eye. I don't know what the issue is, but I can't stand watching this, he muttered under his breath. She's right, you know. This is just wrong. Sierra's heart swelled, but she didn't look at him directly. She couldn't. She had to stay focused. If she lost her grip on her own calm now, the whole thing would spiral. Rebecca's face was now red, her mouth pressed tightly together in an effort to maintain her professionalism. But the cracks were starting to show. Her earlier composure had frayed, her sense of authority crumbling under the weight of the tension. She looked at the other flight attendants in the galley, silently pleading for support. But none came. They, too, understood that this wasn't a typical disagreement. A young flight attendant, one who had been standing at the back, watching the exchange, quietly approached Rebecca and whispered something in her ear. Rebecca's eyes widened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of panic. She quickly glanced at the phone in her hand, where a message had popped up from the airline's operations team. Sierra watched Rebecca's face change as she read the message. Her hand gripped the phone tighter, her fingers trembling now. A few seconds passed, and then Rebecca exhaled slowly, as though she had been holding her breath. She didn't speak right away, instead gathering her thoughts. Finally, she turned to face Sierra fully. Ma'am, Rebecca's voice faltered. She glanced over at Thomas, his face hard and expectant. He had crossed his arms in front of him, his gaze unwavering as he assessed the situation, clearly angry that the problem had not yet been resolved. But Rebecca's attention remained on Sierra. Look, she began, the words coming slowly. I'm sorry. This situation, it shouldn't have gone this far. Sierra raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. It shouldn't have? You're telling me this is about policy? This isn't about policy, Rebecca. It's about power. It's about privilege. And you're reinforcing it. Rebecca flinched, the truth of Sierra's words cutting deeper than she expected. She had been trained to follow the rules, to maintain control, but the reality of what was happening in front of her was now undeniable. The power dynamics were shifting. What had started as a simple request to move had become something much more profound. Sierra held her ground, her shoulders back, eyes steady. She could see that Rebecca was finally breaking under the weight of the moment, her posture slumping slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. "Mr. Harrington can sit elsewhere," Sierra said flatly. "I'm staying right here. And I'm not going to apologize for it." Rebecca swallowed, nodding slowly. "You're right. I'm sorry." For a moment, there was no more need for words. Rebecca stepped back, looking towards the galley, where a few other crew members were now watching her. She hesitated, unsure whether to escalate the situation or let it end. But Sierra had already won. The battle for respect, for her space, for her dignity, had been fought and won in those few moments of confrontation. The silence in the cabin was not one of defeat, it was one of acknowledgement. Passengers were watching, waiting, and they had all seen what had just transpired. Rebecca finally nodded and, with a defeated look, turned to address the rest of the cabin. She made a quick call over the intercom, announcing an update about the flight schedule, anything to smooth over the awkward tension that had blanketed the room. But as the plane continued on its course, Sierra knew the real journey was just beginning. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, as though the very fabric of the plane itself could sense the conflict that was unfolding. Sierra's pulse raced, the adrenaline coursing through her veins like electricity. Her refusal to move wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a stand against every quiet indignity she'd ever endured. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some sympathetic, others more apprehensive, but none daring to speak out until now. Rebecca Mallory, the flight attendant supervisor, stood frozen, her professional composure cracking like thin glass under pressure. The world around her had shifted, her well-practiced routine, built on years of navigating the hierarchy of first-class passengers, was suddenly irrelevant. This wasn't about elite status or accommodating wealthy customers anymore. This was about something much deeper, something that simmered beneath the surface of the polished veneer of service. For a moment, Rebecca hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, looking for someone to help her make sense of the situation. Her eyes darted nervously toward the galley, hoping to find guidance from her colleagues. The hum of the airplane engines seemed to drown out the whispered conversations swirling around her. It was as though the entire cabin had become a silent battleground. And then it happened. A flight attendant, Megan, approached cautiously, her face pale, her lips slightly trembling. She whispered something in Rebecca's ear, too quietly for anyone else to hear, but the change it brought was immediate. Rebecca's face drained of color, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that whatever Megan had said, it was a signal that the situation was about to spiral out of control. Sierra watched them both closely, her chest tight. She had a sense of what was coming. The authority Rebecca had once wielded with so much ease was now slipping from her grasp. The moment of hesitation was all Sierra needed to plant her feet firmly in the ground, metaphorically, of course. But in that instant, she realized that the power in this situation wasn't in the seat or the conflict itself. It was in the choices that would unfold in the next few moments. Rebecca turned back to Sierra, her hands shaking ever so slightly. Her voice was quieter now, but it still held a note of forced professionalism. I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her words heavy with the weight of the decision she knew she had to make. You can stay in your seat." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. The cabin, once buzzing with hushed whispers, fell into an uncomfortable stillness. Sierra didn't immediately react. She simply watched Rebecca, eyes narrowing as if she were waiting for the flight attendant to say something more, something that would acknowledge the real issue at hand. "You're sure about that?" Sierra's voice was steady, but there was a steel edge beneath her words. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making Rebecca face the truth of what had just occurred. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded.
Yes.
There was a misunderstanding. Sierra's lips curled into a thin smile, but it was anything but victorious. A misunderstanding, she repeated softly, almost to herself. Her mind flashed back to every moment of racial tension she'd ever faced in her life. Those moments where a glance, a word, or a decision made her feel small, less than. The uncomfortable realization that this wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern of discrimination that plagued every corner of society. The words hung between them like a bitter truth. Rebecca's apology was hollow, too late to undo the damage that had been done. But the most telling thing was the look on Rebecca's face as she retreated, defeated. There was no anger, no retaliation, only the stark realization that her actions had been wrong. As the flight resumed its course, the cabin remained tense, but something had changed. The passengers, who had once remained silent, were now speaking openly. A man seated in the front row, the one who had spoken up earlier, leaned back in his seat and glanced over at Sierra, his expression softening. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice low but sincere. His words seemed to ripple through the air, cutting through the previous silence. Others began nodding, murmuring their agreement. Sierra looked up at him, feeling a rush of gratitude, though she remained wary. The support was appreciated, but it came with a cost. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Sierra remained still, her body tense, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what she'd expected from this confrontation. A part of her had hoped that by standing her ground, she could force Rebecca and the other staff members to confront their biases, but she never thought it would unfold this way. The repercussions of the incident were still unknown, and the weight of being thrust into the center of a media storm was a burden she wasn't prepared to carry. But something deep inside her, something primal, told her that she had made the right choice. The plane's descent into London began with no fanfare. Outside, the world was dark, the city lights twinkling far below, just as they had when she had boarded hours ago. But for Sierra, everything felt different now. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a witness. Witness to a system that had been built on the backs of people like her, and to an industry that needed to reckon with its own privileges. The light above her seat flickered, signaling that the flight was nearing its end. As the plane touched down, Sierra felt a weight in her chest, something heavy and tangible. It wasn't anger, though she certainly felt that. It wasn't even regret, though the incident would undoubtedly follow her for days, maybe weeks. No, this was something else entirely. It was a sense of having shifted something in the universe, even if only for a brief moment. Because as the flight attendants made their way down the aisles to prepare for the landing, they all seemed to avoid making eye contact with her, guilty, perhaps, of a crime they weren't yet ready to admit. But Sierra had already won. Not in the way she had imagined. Not with loud, sweeping gestures or dramatic applause, but in the quiet defiance that echoed through every part of her being. And as the plane rolled to a stop, she stood up slowly, gathered her things, and prepared to leave, knowing that her fight was far from over. The flight had barely begun its descent into London when the consequences of the incident started to ripple through the cabin, silent at first, but growing louder with each passing minute. Sierra leaned back in her seat, trying to quiet the storm of emotions that swirled within her. The confrontation had been unsettling, yes, but she had stood firm. She had taken her seat back and made it clear, her seat. She had refused to be invisible, to let someone's entitlement trample her dignity. But even as the tension in the cabin had died down, the feeling in her gut hadn't. There was a weight there, a heaviness that threatened to linger even after the airplane's wheels had touched down. Across the aisle, she saw Thomas sitting rigidly, his gaze fixed out of the window, avoiding her. The silence was thick between them. She wondered whether he was angry at her, or perhaps ashamed, though she doubted the latter. In his world, people like him didn't need to be ashamed. A light buzz interrupted her thoughts, pulling her eyes to the in-flight screen where a new message appeared. The notification flashed across the digital interface. Passenger complaint received. Staff feedback requested. Sierra's heart skipped a beat. A complaint? Her first thought was that it was from Thomas, though she wasn't sure if it mattered. She hadn't backed down. She had earned that seat. She clenched her fists in her lap, preparing herself for whatever response came her way. It was part of the battle. She'd been in this fight before, many times. But this time, it felt different. This time, the stakes had escalated beyond her own personal indignity. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, exchanging hurried whispers as they passed. A sense of urgency filled the air. It wasn't just the usual mid-flight protocols. There was something more. Something that made the atmosphere feel charged, tense. Sierra leaned forward, catching fragments of conversation from the crew as they spoke in low voices. The words escalation and social media stood out like neon signs in her mind.
Her phone buzzed again.
This time, it wasn't an in-flight message. It was a notification from one of her friends, a link to a post on social media. Curious and a little hesitant, Sierra opened the link. Her stomach dropped as she read the title of the post. Black passenger forced to give up VIP seat for white customer. What happened on this flight will shock you. Below the title, the post was already trending, with hundreds of comments and dozens of shares. There was a video, blurry but still clear enough to capture the essence of what had transpired. The moment Rebecca had approached her, and the confrontation that followed. It was all there, framed by a clear view of her face, the shock, the defiance, the anger. But what struck her most wasn't the video itself. It was the comments. What a disgrace. How could anyone think this is acceptable? Bravo to the woman who stood her ground. I hope the airline faces consequences for this. No one should ever have to endure this kind of treatment. She should sue. The feedback was overwhelmingly supportive, but also laced with outrage. Sierra could feel the weight of it all, the collective breath held by thousands of strangers, watching her every move, judging the actions of an entire system. She was the face of something larger than herself now, something she hadn't asked for, but had been thrust into the center of. And as much as the support warmed her, the pressure began to feel suffocating. She swiped down the screen, her heart pounding as she saw more notifications coming through. More people were sharing the post, more were talking about it. It was gaining momentum, and with that came the reality. She was no longer just a passenger. She was now part of the story. And stories like these had consequences. Excuse me, ma'am. A flight attendant stood in the aisle next to her, voice polite but tense. We need you to come with us. Sierra's pulse raced. She followed the flight attendant to the front of the cabin, her shoes clicking sharply against the floor. A small group of airline staff was gathered near the cockpit, whispering urgently. Rebecca was there too, standing at the periphery of the group, her eyes darting nervously as Sierra approached. Sierra Williams? A senior manager, his face flushed with discomfort, looked her over briefly before nodding toward Rebecca. I'm Kyle Norton, the duty manager. We need to speak with you about the situation that occurred on board. Sierra's mind whirred, processing everything in a split second. The incident was being taken seriously, and not in the way she expected. They weren't trying to brush it under the rug. They were acknowledging it. She had no idea what to expect, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. I assume you've seen the video? Kyle continued, motioning toward Rebecca, who had remained silent. It's already gone viral. Sierra didn't nod or respond immediately. Her mind was still reeling from the earlier conversation with Rebecca, and now, hearing the confirmation of how widely the video had spread, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. We're deeply sorry for what happened, Kyle said, his voice laced with the practiced tone of corporate apology. We've launched an internal investigation. Please understand that we take these matters very seriously. Clearly, Sierra muttered under her breath, her frustration simmering. But she didn't raise her voice. Not yet. Not until she knew what they would do with this moment. Rebecca spoke then, her voice shaky. I was just following orders, she said, as if that would somehow make her actions justifiable. Sierra's eyes locked onto hers. No, Rebecca, she said firmly, you weren't just following orders. You were upholding a system that told you I wasn't entitled to my space simply because of my skin. You decided that he mattered more. The words hit harder than Sierra intended, but they landed, and the room went quiet. The senior manager shifted uncomfortably, and Rebecca's face reddened. "Rebecca," Kyle said sharply, his tone no longer polite but stern, "we will have to investigate your actions. And as a result of this situation, we've decided to relieve you of your duties effective immediately. You'll be contacted by HR regarding your termination." Rebecca blinked in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words. But none came. Her job, her place in the system, was being taken from her. Not because of an innocent mistake, but because the truth was now undeniable. She had failed to see the injustice that she had helped perpetuate. Sierra didn't feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in watching Rebecca crumble before her. This wasn't a victory she had been aiming for, but it was a necessary reckoning. As Kyle and Rebecca exchanged a few more words, Sierra turned and walked back toward her seat, the weight of the situation still pressing on her chest. She knew the fight was far from over. This wasn't a one-time confrontation. It was the beginning of something larger, and she was ready for whatever came next. The plane touched down in London with a smooth, practiced grace, but Sierra barely noticed. Her mind was still a whirlwind of adrenaline and emotion, replaying every moment of the confrontation, every word exchanged, every sharp look thrown her way. The soft hum of the aircraft's engines gradually gave way to the disembarking sounds of passengers collecting their belongings and moving toward the exits, but Sierra remained seated, her fingers tightly gripping the armrests. She needed a moment to collect herself. The truth of the situation was settling in, like a weight in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd had to stand her ground. It wasn't the first time her very existence had been questioned, reduced to something less than it was because of the color of her skin. But this time, it felt different. The fight had felt different, bigger. It wasn't just a momentary injustice to be ignored or swept under the rug. No, this time the injustice had been caught, exposed to the world. Sierra closed her eyes for a moment, imagining how her story had spread like wildfire, how the video of her confrontation with Rebecca had become a symbol of resistance. She hadn't asked for this kind of attention, but she'd embraced it nonetheless. She wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified, but the feeling of pride was slowly edging out the fear. "I wasn't just fighting for me," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the faint chatter in the cabin. "I was fighting for every person who's ever been made to feel less than they are." She sat there a moment longer, listening to the sounds of people disembarking, the low murmur of conversations. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The tension of the plane seemed to lift with each step taken toward the exit. But Sierra's feet felt heavy, as if the ground itself was a bit more uncertain beneath her now. This wasn't just about one confrontation on a flight. This was something much bigger. A flight attendant, a young woman with wide, sympathetic eyes, approached her. "Ma'am, we're almost at the gate," she said softly, hesitating as though unsure of how to address the moment. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Sierra smiled faintly, looking up at the girl. "No, thank you," she replied. "I just need a moment." The attendant nodded, clearly understanding, and moved on, her footsteps fading into the distance. Sierra inhaled deeply, letting the air fill her lungs before releasing it slowly. She was ready. It was time to face whatever came next. As the last passengers filed off the plane, Sierra slowly stood, gathering her things. Her hand brushed over the strap of her purse, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure what to expect when she stepped off the plane, but she knew one thing: there would be no going back. She had already taken a stand. Now the world was watching. When she stepped into the terminal, she was greeted with the usual rush of passengers moving from gate to gate, but it was the eyes that followed her that caught her attention. There were those who didn't look at her at all, absorbed in their own worlds. But then, there were the others, those who stared with subtle recognition, those whose gaze lingered just a little too long. She couldn't help but wonder if they had seen her face on the news, read the story online, or heard it from the mouths of others. The weight of their eyes was both unsettling and empowering. Sierra didn't know if she should feel self-conscious or proud. But She wasn't going to let their judgment weigh her down. This was her moment. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her reverie. She pulled it out, her heart skipping when she saw the notifications lighting up the screen. Social media, the news, emails, everyone was talking about it. She opened the message from Layla, one of her closest friends from back home, and smiled. "You're a legend. I saw the video. I can't believe how calm you stayed. You've got the whole world watching now. You're going to change things. Just know I'm here for you. Always." The words were a balm to her raw nerves. Layla always knew how to make her feel like she wasn't alone. But the truth was, Sierra did feel alone, in some ways. This wasn't something anyone could truly understand unless they'd lived it themselves. The burden of speaking out, of confronting these systems head-on, was a heavy one to bear. Yet, Sierra couldn't stop now. She knew too much. She had seen too much. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the airline's PR team. They had sent out a statement apologizing for the incident, offering compensation, and promising changes to their internal training processes. The usual corporate speak, but this one felt different, genuine almost. But Sierra knew better than to trust the words on the screen. The real test would come in the weeks ahead, when the dust began to settle, when the outrage faded, and when the media turned its attention elsewhere. Would the airline follow through on their promises? Or would it be business as usual? Sierra slid the phone into her pocket, a determined set to her jaw. She didn't have time to wait for the airline to change. She wasn't going to wait for the world to wake up. She had to keep pushing. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Sierra stepped inside, her reflection staring back at her in the mirrored walls. She was exhausted, but she felt a fire burning within her. This was only the beginning, she reminded herself. There was so much more to do. She wasn't just a passenger on this journey. She was the driver. As the elevator descended to the baggage claim, her thoughts turned to the ripple effect of the event. The video of her confrontation had already begun to spread, and within hours, people from all corners of the world were sharing their own stories of discrimination. Messages of support poured in from strangers, many of whom were grateful to see someone finally standing up to these injustices, someone finally fighting back. The story had sparked something in them. It wasn't just about one flight. It was about the systemic problems that had gone unchallenged for too long. When Sierra stepped into the baggage claim area, she saw the glowing faces of a few more news cameras, the glint of the lenses trained on her. They were waiting for her. But she wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, and pushed aside. She was no longer an individual. She was a symbol. Sierra moved through the crowd, the weight of the eyes on her now almost like a familiar cloak. She had done it. She had made her stand. And now? Now, she was going to make sure it mattered. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Sierra's reflection in the glass doors of the baggage claim mirrored the confidence she was now beginning to feel in her bones. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been made to feel less than, pushed down, or silenced. And as she walked toward the exit, her footsteps were sure, steady, filled with the promise of change. The journey was far from over, but Sierra knew one thing for sure: it had only just begun. The air in the airport lounge was thick with the hum of distant voices, the clinking of coffee cups, and the quiet shuffle of shoes on polished floors. Sierra sat in a corner, her gaze fixed on the large windows where planes took off and landed in a constant rhythm. She was waiting for her next flight, a routine business trip, but it felt different this time. Every part of her, from the curve of her shoulders to the set of her jaw, was heavy with the weight of what had happened. The event on the plane had become a part of her, woven into her very being. It was no longer just an isolated incident. It was a chapter in the story she had yet to fully understand. She felt the pull of the world outside the glass, people rushing to catch flights, lives intertwining, each person carrying their own unspoken burdens. But Sierra had become keenly aware of something more now. She was no longer just another face in the crowd. She had become the face of a movement, a voice for those who couldn't, or wouldn't, speak up. What had started as a confrontation over a seat had turned into something far greater, something that resonated in boardrooms, living rooms, and newsrooms alike. Her phone buzzed softly on the table, breaking her reverie. She glanced at it, almost as if expecting the name that had become so familiar to her over the past week. It was Carmen, her friend and ally, reaching out with an update. "I just saw the article in the Times. They're calling you the voice of resistance. You're trending. Big things are coming, girl." Sierra's fingers hovered over the screen, the message a reminder that the story had taken on a life of its own. It was overwhelming, but she couldn't deny the thrill that stirred within her. People were listening. Her voice mattered. She typed back quickly, her thoughts rushing onto the screen. "I didn't ask for this, Carmen. I'm still processing everything. But I'll keep speaking up. I have to." As she hit send, a quiet sense of resolve settled over her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been dismissed because of their race, gender, or background. She was fighting for the generations to come, for the children who would grow up in a world that still struggled with the same biases she had faced her entire life. Her thoughts were interrupted by the announcement overhead. "Flight 478 to London is now boarding at Gate 32. Please make your way to the gate." "Thank you." Sierra stood, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she made her way toward the gate. The motion was automatic, almost mechanical, but her mind was racing, the weight of her newfound purpose pressing down on her chest. As she walked, she could feel the eyes of the travelers around her, some curious, others indifferent, and a few with a hint of recognition. She could sense that her presence, her very being, was a statement now. At the gate, the flight attendant handed her a boarding pass. Their eyes met for a moment, a fleeting moment of silent acknowledgement. No words were exchanged, but Sierra felt something shift between them. The flight attendant knew who she was. Sierra didn't need to ask. She was the woman who had stood up, who had refused to be silenced. And in that recognition, Sierra felt a quiet surge of pride. The journey ahead felt like a metaphor for what was to come. The plane would take her to another city, another meeting, another business trip. But as the plane took off, her mind wandered to the broader journey that lay ahead, the journey of dismantling the very systems that had put her in that seat in the first place. She found her seat, settled into it, and looked around. The first-class cabin was luxurious, a haven of white linen, leather, and quiet luxury. But for Sierra, it wasn't just a space of comfort anymore. It was a reminder. A reminder of how far she had come and how much further she had to go. She was aware, more than ever, of how the world saw her. A black woman in a seat that wasn't supposed to be hers. A black woman who had refused to be invisible. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks, food, and polite smiles. Sierra caught a glance from one of them, a young woman whose expression held a quiet gratitude. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. The unspoken bond between them was enough to remind Sierra that change wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was in the small gestures, the subtle shifts in how people saw each other. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from her colleague, Jordan. "The team wants to do a feature on you for the company newsletter. You're making waves, Sierra. It's time for that conversation about diversity we've been avoiding." Sierra smiled, a little surprised by how the tides had turned. She'd been an advocate for diversity and inclusion for years, but now it felt like her own story was part of that narrative. She was no longer just a voice in the crowd. She was part of the conversation, driving it forward. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Sierra leaned back in her seat, her mind drifting. The life she had known, the world she had navigated, felt different now. Her fight had just begun. And yet, in that moment of quiet reflection, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was ready. The world would see her. They would hear her. They would have to. Her phone buzzed once more, and this time it was a news alert. Protests erupt in response to widespread systemic inequality. Voices of resistance demand action. Sierra's heart quickened, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was exhilaration. The voices were growing louder. Her voice was growing louder. and the future was waiting. Subscribe to our channel for soul-stirring stories.